How does it's like eye control? They'll be playing the slides from the other side, so you can start. So how will I be able to see the slides?
Can you ask them to play the slides?
Just a moment, sir. Am I already live?
Yes.
People are able to see me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay, so that will be...
Yes, sir.
All right.
And I think we have an option here to move it. They'll just here.
No, I don't think I have control.
Okay. You can just ask them to change.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here today. This is going to be a first for me, where I'm kind of talking to an empty, as far as I can see, an empty space, but yet there are many of you out there in the virtual world. So I apologize if I'm going to look a little bit distracted a little bit, but it's going to be an interesting exercise for me as we go post-COVID into this hybrid world of real versus in the virtual world. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And I thought today I would talk about an education for flourishing. Planetary flourishing is something that we need very urgently. As many of you know that in a week or even in the next few days, COP on climate change is going to take place in Abu Dhabi. We have a climate crisis on our hands. We don't seem to be responding to the way that we should. At the same time, we have a crisis in the Middle East in terms of the Palestine-Israel conflict. We have the Ukrainian conflict, and we have an increase in the number of I wouldn't say global as what has happened in the past, but a lot of localized regional conflicts. And I think we need to take cognizance of that. But we also need to take cognizance of another emerging problem, and that's about the deteriorating mental health among our younger generation. And this is becoming a serious issue. So we got a multitude of these crises. And as I talk to educators here, we also have a learning crisis. And maybe some of this is perpetuated by that, is that the recent report from the World Bank kind of said on the global average, more than 7 out of 10 kids can't read and comprehend a simple passage at the age of 10. This is a frightening statistics because what it will lead to is a greater divide among people, both within nations as well as across nations. And I remember over the weekend reading about an article that was put on the web by NASA, which talked about a number of black spots in the sun. And they were talking about what that will have an implication on the planet in terms of geostorms and so forth. And I kind of said to myself, and I said, oh my God, we are, at the end of the day, a small little ball, a beautiful ball in this vast cosmos, the galaxy. And this is only one of many thousands of galaxies. And here we are spending our time fighting over, measly resources when we should, as a collective, be thinking about exploring the cosmos. I'm a fan of Star Trek, and one of the things that when I leave this life would be the biggest regret is that I would never be able to travel through space, to explore this wide but I think beautiful world that we have outside the planet. So we need to start coming together as a community, not just the human species, but all living things on this planet. It is a beautiful planet, and I think we need to we should start putting aside our differences, which I think are very petty differences, and sort of look at how we as a community can flourish. And that's why I talk about planetary flourishing is so important. And I think that's the goal of education. The goal of education should not be about simple things like, providing the kind of competencies for people to find jobs and so forth. That's important. But I think flourishing, and I'm going to define what flourishing is, because many people talk about these terms without really sort of saying what it exactly means. And I would tell you a little bit about flourishing and how it actually came out from a massive study involving more than 300 scientists to come to a common understanding of what flourishing is. So can I have the slide? I don't think I have agency over my slides today, so I'll depend on a colleague to put the first slide on. The reality number one. Here it is. So I'm going to ask my colleagues here to alert me when I'm about 5 minutes from my time. I think I have about 40 minutes today.
Yeah, 40.
Yeah. So maybe in about 5 minutes, because I have a bad habit of just rambling on when I get excited about a topic, and today I'm really excited about this topic. But reality one is we are social animals, and I remember a lot of my social scientist colleagues, when I used the word animals, they got all up in arms and saying, "Oh, you're considering us," but that's reality is we are one species among a whole huge basket of species on this planet. But what's important is our flourishing is dependent on others. And when I say others, I mean all living beings, not just our own species. And we have ample evidence now from both the behavioral psychology, the neurosciences, and so forth, that our flourishing, the way that that reacts, the way we react, the kind of neurotransmitters that make us feel good, are triggered by good experiences with others as well as with nature. Nature is not just to be seen as a resource extractive, but it is, I think the challenge is how do we find a relationship of love with nature? And the reason I'm going to talk about an education system is one of the preambles of UNESCO. It starts off with war start in the minds of men. I need to change that to people. And therefore, the defenses of peace have to be built in the minds of people. And how do we build those defenses is basically what I'm going to be, the gist of my talk today is about building kinder brains. And that's so important. That's the fundamental, I think, goal of education. Because once we get that right, everything else falls into place. As an economist, I say everything else is a positive externality of when we produce kinder brains. Doing well in a job, finding work. These are all externalities to me. I would not start off with building the social competencies to make us better, productive pieces in an economic system, and then hoping that we'll become kind people. No, it won't work that way. And there are organizations which start off on that premise, and I intentionally push back. And I sort of say the fundamental goal is to build kinder brains, kinder people, and everything else falls into place. So that's the first reality. The second reality is that we have outsmarted ourselves in a sense that we have focused so much on technology, and it's important. I think it's made life a lot more, but we have outsmarted ourselves by putting in so much systems in place that go against our very nature, that we are social animals. We sit in our rooms, we hardly have interactions with others, we have the phones, we communicate. It's interesting how in a recent experience in a restaurant, I saw two people, young people. I think they were on a date, and I was just thinking of the times when I was much younger, going on a date. It was so much fun, and they were communicating on their phones. It was like, what? There they were sitting right across each other. So I think we need to get back to sometimes basics. I'm not an anti-technologist. In fact, on the contrary, I've been criticized as being a techie. Uh, and I embrace it. But at the same time, I embrace social connections with all living things. I emphasize the word all living things, not just with my fellow human beings, but with all living beings. The third reality, I think there are only two realities. The good news is that, and this is a relatively new concept, I think it's about 20, 30 years old. This whole notion about neuroplasticity is that we are not born with a set of fixed neural networks, and this is the way that we are. We actually can change that, and it's being changed all the time. Our education systems change that. Our economic systems change that. So when somebody says, I don't want my brains to be changed, that's been really ignorant, because it is constantly changing. The neural networks are constantly changing. And this whole notion of neuroplasticity gave us hope, because it gave me hope when I came on to this, is that I've been trained as a traditional neoclassical economist. And those are one of the most dangerous species on the planet, because we think of just optimization, we think about just the individual satiation and so forth. And thank God for neuroplasticity. I actually now have, based on actual personal observation, I hope others agree with that, is that I understand the relationship with others. It's not about just myself. It is about the fact that my well-being is dependent on others, and there is a satiation point. It's not like the fundamental economic axiom that there is no bliss point. I think that's the thing that we have to be very careful about. So we can train our brains for flourishing. So what is flourishing? Let me go to the next slide. So pre-COVID, well, maybe even before that, I was really getting bored at the Institute. It was like, let's do something interesting. Let's have something that we can get together and party at the same time. And one of my best experiences was, there was an assessment that was commissioned by Kofi Annan in 2000 called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where we brought together more than about 1,500 over scientists from across the world, 5 years. And we were trying to understand the relationship between humans and nature. And we really got some really interesting results. So I said, hey, why don't we do something for education? Because when we looked at the literature, there's something, this has never been done before within the education field. So we put together this assessment, took 2.5 years, COVID hit us. So my hope for parties kind of just went off the air because we couldn't meet. But we met virtually, just like what we are doing right now. It was a tough endeavor, monitoring, organizing 300 over scientists from different disciplines, which was very important. It had to be transdisciplinary. And where many of them had not met each other and they were meeting virtually, and many of them did not agree with each other on the whole notion of the purpose of education and the role of science and so forth. But can I have the next slide? I think we'll move to the next slide. So the first thing that we did is, what do we as a collective understand from what human flourishing is and its relationship with education? And so this is what came out after the 2.5 years. Human flourishing is both the optimal continuing development of human beings' potentials. I want to keep the word potential here, because potentiality is, I think, the way that we should move towards in terms of evaluating a person rather than using merits. I'm against using merits as a basis of rewards and evaluating a person, but potentiality. And the potentiality is about how the person themselves are improving within themselves. So they are their own benchmarks. And that's the whole notion of potentiality. Not being evaluated against a whole group of other people, but against yourself. That's the most important thing. If you're learning, that's what education is about. If you're doing that, then we're doing a relatively good job. And living well as a human being, which means, what does that mean? Which means being engaged in relationships, that's important, and activities that are meaningful to yourself. So we brought in a lot of Amartya Sen's work in a sense of what it means to for your own self, aligned with both your own values and humanistic values. So you also have to understand that we live within this broader cosmos of other beings in a way that is satisfying to them. So if you look at these definitions, the terms potential sticks out, the term relationships stick out, the notion of agency sticks out, the notion of values sticks out. And then, of course, flourishing is conditional on the contribution of individuals and requires an enabling environment. You don't live in a vacuum. So we need to recognize that. So next slide, please. So we go on to building the kinder brain. So how do we do this? Based on this, all right, great, flourishing, we have defined it. How do we do this? How do we change that mindset that I talked about earlier in terms of UNESCO's building the defenses of peace? This is a framework that we developed in the Institute based on a broad literature review of social emotional learning, education, and so forth. And I'm a fan of Einstein. And of course, you can see some relevance here, EMC squared. I just sort of say Einstein got it right or wrong by putting E equals. It is EMC squared. And these are competencies that he also valued quite a bit. Empathy. Empathy here means understanding the other. Cognitive empathy, affective empathy. We have so many different definitions, as through into academics, we tend to complicate simple processes. But empathy is about understanding the other from their perspective, not from your own perspective. But you got to put yourself in their shoes to understand how they feel and what their actions are, and not to sort of put value statements already on their actions. There's a reason for them to do that. And I always get a lot of flack when I say, when a suicide bomber blows themselves up, there is a reason for doing that. Life is so precious. Why? We need to understand what was going and stuff. Then is mindfulness. Mindfulness here is about living in the present, not at this moment, not in the past, not in the future. And for mindfulness, I believe emotion regulation is important and self-regulation is important. Attention is regulation is important. These are the three main things that we took under mindfulness. Things that we have to build in this within the education system. Emotion regulation, to recognize the emotions that are running through you. It's okay. It's not about suppressing emotions. It's not about regulating it. It's about, I would say regulating is fine, but not about suppressing. So anger is fine. It's a natural emotion of human beings. But to understand and then to recognize and to understand and then to react to that particular emotion is important. Compassion is about doing something that will have helped the others. It's very close to kindness. Then critical inquiry, because the reason we put critical inquiry into this framework is that we did a thought exercise, and what we found is that you can be empathetic, you can be mindful, you can be compassionate, and you can still justify a suicide bomber. But if you bring in critical inquiry, to start questioning, to do counterfactual arguments, then you get a more rounded approach in terms of, hey, this makes no sense. And is there really a reason? Is there a doctrine? Is there an ideology which says I can achieve this by this? And so critical inquiry is so important into that. And therefore, we started understanding, in terms of when it comes to education, the learning process. Now, we focus so much in our education on what I call the academic part. Many people say cognition, but we make it the knowledge part. It's about transmitting knowledge. It's important. I'm not saying that's not important. I think the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure if you can see the slide. No, the one before that. I think this is AI playing a role in the background saying, I don't think this is the way you should do this. But I got control of the system again. So this came out from the assessment, the 2.5-year assessment. It was called ICTE, the International Science and Education Evidence Education Assessment. Now, what we learned from that is that the whole learning process is not just one of academic acquisition or knowledge, but cognition is important. What do I mean by cognition? Cognition is about the working memory. It's about executive functions. And it kind of rung a bell and lit a bulb in my brain based on my own experiences with my children. My oldest was diagnosed with acute dyslexia when he was very young. And we struggled, and he struggled with all the schools that we had available for him until we found a special school in the US that focused only on kids with dyslexia. And so they did an evaluation and they did a diagnostic testing. And you know what? They found that his working memory was only about 10 to 15%. So they said, look, we can't do any interventions on reading and writing, which is what most dyslexic would have done, which is what some of his schools provided in terms of special remediation classes with teachers on reading and writing. It didn't work. And what happened was his working memory was only 10 to 15%. So the school said we have to build his working memory before we do any other interventions. And when this happened in this assessment, it said, oh my God, yes, I remember this. So how many of us focus on working memory or even think about working memory in the school curriculum? There are techniques to do that. There are diagnostic tests to sort of say at what level is the working. Some of us are lucky, and these are the ones who do naturally well in school. Many of us struggle, including myself, but we manage. But there are a significant number that don't. And that is a violation of their human rights. Article 26 of the International Declaration of Human Rights says an education is a right. I don't think that's sufficient. I think a personalized, individualized education is a human right. By providing a one-size model fits for all and giving it to all would be a violation of the rights of the majority. So, cognition. Then the social and emotional competencies, which we had talked earlier, the EMC. The other C would come as a combination of academic and cognition. So when we teach maths, I'll give you an example. If we teach maths or chemistry, it's not about just now you have a more difficult test. You got to then include the notion of how do I build a working memory in the way I deliver my chemistry or mathematics. The academic is taken care of. Then how do I build the emotional and social competencies like attention regulation, emotion regulation? When we have maths fear, maths anxiety. How do you overcome that? And that one of the ways of that is emotion regulation, and so forth. So teaching now becomes a lot more complex endeavor. It was already very difficult, and many of you as teachers would recognize that. But now I'm sort of saying it's in fact a much more complex endeavor that we have to reach and achieve. Which means you guys have to demand higher salaries as well. So the next process, the next slide, please. So I come to the way we deliver the case approach, embracing the EMC framework is what we call the Libre process. As you can see, we just love all these terminologies at the Institute. What is the Libre process? It's Libre in many words is a freedom, freeing kind of exercise. So we talk about games and gamification. We have a whole gaming team at the Institute that focus on how you use games in teaching all kinds of things, not just social, emotional, but maths and so forth. The notion of reflection, storytelling. I'm sure as educators, you know how storytelling really grabs the attention of children. Dialogue, having a dialogue, a Socratic process, rather than just a one-way translation of the learning process, to have a dialogue with your students, and inquiry as well. So this comes to the whole notion of a personalized education. Now, many of you will be saying, how on earth am I going to do that with a class of 40 or 50 people, students? Well, this is where I think technology is going to help a lot. As we go digital, and the Institute is very digital savvy, we have our own learning platform. I call it the LEAP. It's not a learning management system. It's a learning experience platform, analytical platform. Because it's not about just managing students. It's about providing an enriching learning experience in the virtual world, using the virtual world. And this allows that individualized process where then teachers, educators as yourself, become mentors and coaches, which is a new responsibility rather than just providers of knowledge. Next slide, please. And people, this actually works because I'm going to show you some preliminary evidence from our case studies where we did with 189 students from India, Afghanistan, and Bhutan. We wanted, in a sense of looking at students from very different countries, very different social backgrounds, and so forth. And we have indicators or metrics for measuring empathy, mindfulness, and compassion. If you want to know more about this, please write to us. Much of this is published, and we are more than happy to send you those papers. And you can see how the pre and post, there were some significant changes, especially in empathy. You see major changes across these three different groups. Now, there were differences in the countries, but I've just aggregated to show that this really works in terms of having empathy, mindfulness, and compassion. I think what we didn't have the notion, the element of critical inquiry explicitly built into it, but what we do in our courses is we use an issue at hand, and it becomes a dialogic process and what I would call a Socratic process as the kids learn, and then we are focusing on these competencies. Next slide, please. How much time do I have?
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Great. For the first time, I'm actually on track. So we have to not look at our students in isolation, because if we build these competencies in isolation, they come and get it in school, but then they live in a broader environment. So we need to look at both across temporal, when I mean temporal from the young to old. So we have to work with the parents, we have to work with the grandparents, and so forth. So how do you build the community within the school environment? It's a challenge. Yes, I agree with that. A lot of this, when I talk to you, you say, yeah, it's very easy in theory. It is, I do admit it is a challenge, but I think it is the returns are so high that we should invest in these new structures, the new school learning environment, as we call them. So, and then it's no point we training the teachers, training the students, but what about the administrators? How about the political institutions? One of my biggest hopes is that we get all our decision makers right from the very, very top, the head of state, down to the bureaucrat who's responsible for implementation, to take social and emotional learning courses. But of course, using the case approach in terms of building the whole notion of using theme-based. So I think we at the Institute recognize this. We are now building a module for decision makers. And we have very senior bureaucrats, we have very senior decision makers, and I'm hoping that we will also get the political actors to be recipients of this particular module. It will be interesting to do a pre and post and compare them with the level of neuroplasticity between the different groups of people. Do some groups have higher neuroplasticity than others? We know that neuroplasticity is at the highest at the very young stage. Hackman study from economics very early on, he got a Nobel Prize for that work in terms of how neuroplasticity is really elastic at the very, very young age. Now, next slide, please. I want to do some key take-home messages and maybe some questions. I'm not sure how this works in the virtual world. But what I want to leave you today is a kinder world is a peaceful and sustainable world. It's it's no longer, I think, an assumption. It's an axiom that we should accept as a starting point. We now have enough knowledge that we can train our brains to be kind, which means training our brains to be responsive to the very nature of our self, of our being, we are neurobiologically wired to be kind. But at the same instance, if we don't continuously train and aspire to use that natural property, it can become extremely violent, as we also, with the same networks. Robert Sapolsky, in his book Behave, shows this very, very eloquently. And then we must base our learning interventions on rigorous science and evidence. I think education has too long been driven by opinions of well-intentioned individuals, because I don't think anybody is ill-intentioned, but it's well-intentioned, but that's not sufficient. It worked well for me, so it should work well for everybody else. No, it doesn't work that way, because we are all different. And I remember when we were doing the assessment, the experts really pushed to have one chapter on difference learning and different individuals, in a sense that one was focused on learning difficulties and the other is learning differences. And I couldn't understand the differences, but there are. And so it's very important that we bring in the science. And I will tell you an example that I just, at a recent conference, where a very prominent academic, Daniel Ansari, who has done a lot on numeracy, and most of our stuff right now is been based on the kind of tools that have been developed, and it was based on symbolic approaches towards numeracy development. And this was based on research, extensive, very strong research. But the problem was all this research was done in developed Western countries, industrialized countries. Now, they wanted to say, now, would this be the same in other countries, in other different contexts? And so the early studies that he has, the results from a number of studies in Africa, show the complete opposite, where symbolic is not as effective as non-symbolic. And so context is so important. But this only comes out when you have these kinds of science-driven studies. And we need more of that, especially in the global south. And most importantly, this science cannot be dominated by one particular discipline, but it must involve a multitude of disciplines. So the notion of transdisciplinary science, which is what I had even omitted in this last slide. It should be interventions on rigorous transdisciplinary science and replicable evidence. Because if you can't replicate that evidence, then you understand that it is very context specific. But there are, in many instances, it is irrelevant of context. It cuts across all countries, across all individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anantha Durrraipah. Dr. Durrraipah, we have a few questions. Would you like to take them? Or
Sure.
Okay. Okay, the question that you have is, how might we more effectively help school systems or nation states recognize the hard data around?
So my first counter question to the person who submitted is, what do you define by hard data? So that then I can answer appropriately. How will I be more effective help school systems recognize the hard data around kindness? That is not an add-on, but a must for sustainable future for all. Well, I think I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to uh, address answer that. So if I
Can have another.
no. I want to go. I haven't answered that question. Can we go up again?
Sure.
Yeah. Can I get this thing out so that I can see who's this person?
Carla Marshall.
Carla Marshall. Okay, Dresden. Carla, maybe if you could say what do you mean by hard data around kindness? Is it in terms of the kind of data that I have shown into a combination of empathy, mindfulness, and so forth?
I think it would take time for them to respond. Okay.
I wouldn't mark as answered. I haven't done I haven't answered it yet. This is the problem when you don't have, when you have the physical presence. But I'm just trying to figure out what you might mean by what you're trying to get out, get your question. Hard data.
Hello.
Okay, here we are.
Hi. I guess my question there is really around it not being what is often called a soft skill, but actually, if we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and the future security and peace of the planet, then actually kindness is an integral skill that can be taught, which you showed in the pre-post data from those 3 countries. So how do we more effectively position the learning around kindness, empathy, mindfulness within those school systems to better show the relationship now and in the future?
So I think one of the main ways of doing that would be I wouldn't want to test and see whether people are kind or not, because then we fall into the assessment trap and so forth. But the way to integrate that is not to have. So there has been a push for us to have social and emotional learning as a subject, and we have been resisting that. What it should be is it should be integrated within the whole curriculum, within the whole school system. And I'm pushing for that school system should involve the community in which it works and thrives on. And therefore the continuum of individual, family, community, school, and how that then becomes an integral part of a new mindset that kind of centers around the concept of kindness. Does that even go close to what you're having, or is it more in collecting data and so forth?
So yes, I think that helps. I mean, what you're describing is taking a whole systems approach and not just involving the child in the school, but actually the wider community, and also taking a more integrated approach where the quote unquote social emotional learning skills are actually embedded in the learning of the content knowledge as well, so that it's cross-cutting to better and more effectively integrate it into the curriculum. So thank you for that.
Just to add on, I think one of the most the biggest challenge for teachers would be to use a theme. So for like to try to get across a concept, a mathematical concept, rather than just doing the concept and the mathematics, is to take a real world example, and then through that example tease out the mathematical understanding. But in that teasing out process, then also start building some of the social emotional competencies as well as the cognitive competencies. that's why I say it's going to become a much more complex process, which means we need to redesign both the teacher training in service as well as out service programs. Some of the other, I saw some very nice questions here. Next one is,
I think we can just scroll down.
wait, let me do this.
Maybe this.
All right, this is a good question. Is it great to see the progress for compassion on SS? It is difficult to quantify social and emotional skills of children. What can be the effective approach? So we kind of started this, hang on, so we have and this has been a quintessential question every time that we do this. So we developed a couple of frameworks. The EMC squad was one, but then we had a working group of experts and scientists from different disciplines. We had a couple of meetings, and they all kind of then came up with a vector of different variables that one should consider. But empathy kind of came up as one which there's enough data, enough verified data and literature to focus on using as an indicator. So but I think at some point, administrators and decision makers are going to say, is your intervention making a change? Because there's been a flurry of interventions on social emotional, and people saying ours works, but when it really comes to kind of quantifying and saying, does it really work? I think we are still at very early days. So an effective approach would be, I would say, to always look and sort of treat the whole schooling learning experience as a research study, as a broad global research study, looking at it from a research lens.
I think we can take a last question, sir.
That was one.
Okay.
So most of the others were just kind of acknowledgements and agreements and stuff. Thank you for your patience. I would have hoped to have seen you all in live, but hopefully one day we will do that.
Thank you. So I would just like to take a moment to talk about Dr. Anantha. So this year is really, really, really special for us to have heard him. In fact, we have been trying to get him since 2017. So this year, finally, we have got him. And I think this is also Dr. Anantha's last year at UNESCO MGIEP. So it makes it all the more special for us. Dr. Anantha has been a very engaging and involved figure who engages and involves young people. I think we've been a beneficiary of his initiatives out here. The SEL framework that Dr. Anantha was talking about, we have applied it to one of the most important programs of Global Citizenship Foundation, the Mentor Intern program. And perhaps it's in its 15th edition now. And I think we have got some tremendous results. And we've had people from more than 40 to 50 countries who have participated in the program. So the program is highly effective. The framework is highly effective. So we have greatly benefited from Dr. Anantha Durrraipah's leadership. So we want to thank him for his service, both to the Institute as well as to young people around the world. So thank you so much, Dr. Anantha Durrraipah, for having come here and graced the occasion. So now we proceed to the next part of the event. Thank you so much for listening to us. I hope you had a great time. Thank you once again. Let's move on to the networking space. Thank you.